Hello, and welcome to the Race, Wealth, and Health Podcast, a podcast that serves to educate and empower while we explore the intersections of social justice, economic empowerment, and holistic well-being within communities of color. I am your host, Dr. Joycelyn Morris, and I invite you to join me as we dive deep into the crucial topics that shape our lives, challenge the status quo, and strive for a more equitable future for all. Hello. Welcome to another episode of Race, Wealth, and Health. I'm your host, Joycelyn Morris, and I'm super excited to have Ericka Taylor with me on the podcast today. Welcome, Ericka.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yes, Ericka's going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, which is the wealth gap and ways that we can unravel and sort of break down the wealth gap. But before we do that, I want to give a very brief introduction to our listeners. So Ericka Taylor is currently the acting chief of staff and director of popular education for the organization Take on Wall Street at AFREF, which she's going to tell us exactly what those acronyms mean. But prior to joining Take on Wall Street initiative, she served as co-director of the DC Working Families Party. Ericka spent the bulk of her career organizing and advocacy, including positions with Organizing Neighborhood Equity, DC ACORN, and Tenants and Workers Support Committee. She's also worked as a program officer with the Public Welfare Foundation and trained youth organizers as a Southeast Regional Program Coordinator for Youth Action. Ericka has served on the boards of Western States Center, National Priorities Project, La Clínica del Pueblo, and Jews United for Justice. And currently she sits on the board of the Penn Faulkner Foundation. So with that, I say welcome again, Ericka. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Joycelyn. I really appreciate your having me.
So let's start by you telling me a little bit about yourself. So I struggled over the acronyms, but basically AFR is Americans for Financial Reform, right? And so you work specifically as part of the Take on Wall Street initiative or campaign there. Tell us a little bit about that and then how you got into this space and work.
Sure. So Americans for Financial Reform, which is the mother organization, as you said, of Take on Wall Street, was formed in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, right? So there was a point when folks said we really need to hold Wall Street accountable for what they've done, and we need stronger regulations in place. So a couple hundred organizations came together. These are, faith-based organizations, consumer groups, civil rights groups, labor groups, and fought really hard. And AFR, this coalition, was central in passing what became the Dodd-Frank law for financial reform, and from out of which was born the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is one of our most powerful agencies in the government for sort of like standing up for consumers and fighting back against everything from predatory lenders to private for-profit colleges that have sort of ripped people off and falsified their placement rates. So that's AFR. And Take on Wall Street was born in 2016, a few years later, because Dodd-Frank is fantastic. The Consumer Financial Protection Board is amazing, and yet we still have so far to go. So Take on Wall Street was a campaign to sort of say, look, we've won these reforms, we need to protect them, but we need to go further. So we have sort of a three-pronged approach at Take on Wall Street, which is to train progressives, to inform the political debate, because we have a C4 arm so we can engage with electeds and candidates, and then to deliver policy change, covering everything from executive compensation to saving the post office to public banking to countering, I think, ESG, the environmental, social, and governance concerns seem to be like the new CRL or CRT, critical race theory, of the day, sort of like these mythologies popping up and that distract people from what the reality is. So that's Take on Wall Street in a nutshell. When you read my bio, it's very clear that I'm a generalist. And so I came to this work, honestly, less through the issue area and more through the strategy of popular education, because I've played a number of roles in my career, but at my heart, I'm a popular educator and I love training and facilitation and popular education, which is a slightly different model. Not slightly, it's a dramatically different model than sort of like the mini standard educational system. So the opportunity to work for the popular education program brought me into the fold.
Thank you so much for that background and introduction. And for our listeners, so I wasn't originally aware of the Americans for Financial Reform. I'm very aware of Dodd-Frank. For listeners who know, like my background was in finance. So I used to work on Wall Street. I actually started in 2007, so whatever that's worth, right before the crash. So I remember, and then, you know, experienced the bulk of my career post the crash. So I remember all the auditing, Dodd-Frank, like that was definitely a big term frequently used at the bank, but forgot to mention sort of how we came to connect. And so, because I had not heard of the organization, but your communication associate actually reached out from Americans for Financial Reform, and I guess somehow the podcast got on his radar, and Eric and I was able to have a really great introductory call, which I enjoyed, and I was so excited again to kind of nerd out and talk about the things that are important as it relates to this wealth gap, right? And so I was so intrigued by your experience as it relates to being on the ground and working with the wealth gap. But one of the things you mentioned in terms of working with the popular education model. So I don't want to assume that our listeners know what that is. So if you can give us a brief understanding of what it is, and then what does it look like in terms of your day-to-day work?
Fair enough, no problem. Yes, popular education is not nearly as well known as, because like people education isn't that everything? But this is a
Right.
very specific model that was created by this Brazilian educator, Paulo Freire. And the idea is more of a how than a what. So it's like a modality of teaching. So popular education counters the passive approach that we often see, in the States in school systems, where you have a person with wisdom at the front of the room, and everyone else is a sort of these, passive vessels waiting to be filled with their knowledge. Popular education comes from a sense that no matter what your role in society, what your background is, your life includes experiences that are based on sort of how the world operates, right? You understand systems innately just because of the way certain systems interact with you. So, popular education is about drawing from people's lived experiences, and then it's not just about bringing forth that knowledge, but it's very directly and clearly about transformation. So it's not popular education if the end goal isn't change. The nature of popular education isn't all things are equal. Both sidesism is an antithesis to that, because popular education believes we do not have justice in the world. So it's very much oriented towards social justice, economic justice, racial justice,
Yeah.
and the systems are wrong. So it takes us coming together and using our collective knowledge to build systems that meet the needs of everyone.
I like that. To your point, it's not something I was super familiar with. And how long has this education model been around?
Yeah, Freire, I want to say the big book that he created was a Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and I want to say that came out in the late 50s, early 60s. So it's not quite 100 years old, but it's been warmly received sort of in social justice and activist circles, because of this sort of flipping of the dynamic and recognizing the power of regular everyday people.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. I'd love to, with my guests, really understand how they got to where they are, right? So, the beautiful thing that I get to do is interview people who are very passionate about the work that they're doing. And so, it's always interesting to me to see or hear about that career journey and that arc. So, how did you came into the work that you're currently doing? Because if I recall correctly, you start out on a very different path as college. So, please do share.
Absolutely, and I did. My expectation from middle school and certainly high school on was that I would be a journalist, working for magazines, living in Greenwich Village. I had a very clear vision.
This is a nice neighborhood. It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'd never been even at that point in my life, but I'd heard about the mystique, and I'm like, this is a cool spot. And I had the privilege of attending my undergrad university as a rising high school senior, and taking, as I love English lit, and I was taking a lit class, and my professors, mentioned to us all that you should study what you love. He's like, people want to know that you can think when you graduate. So don't worry about majoring in something that's sort of career oriented. If you want to become a doctor and you'd rather not major in biology, then maybe there's something wrong with your sort of right career alignment there, right? So I thought, well, I don't really, journalism was what I envisioned, because I know that it comes with an income, right? And
Right.
fiction is what I love, and so I thought, okay, well, I'm just gonna major in English, which I did, and wrote. I was a columnist when I was in undergrad, and with our daily paper, I wasn't a daily columnist. I only published every week, but when I graduated, because all the writing I'd done with a student paper, I was able to get a job with the university alumni magazine, and I covered all these amazing people doing this brilliant work out in the world. And I thought, you know what? I'm young. I want to do this work. I don't want to just write about it. I want to get in there and dig
Right.
around. So
Mm-hmm.
I moved down to DC and became a community organizer. And from there, was sort of pulled into the movement work. I learned all about everything from community benefits agreements to predatory lending to affordable housing crises because of slumlords, and was given the language to put to things that I witnessed, right? Like gentrification is visible in lots of places, but this gave me a framework to understand what was going on. And as time went on, I realized, okay, well, we're addressing these problems. And I believe, and I think that our sort of primary orientation at Take on Wall Street is that you can't really solve a problem without understanding where it came from, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
when we talk about the racial wealth divide, one thing that I'm really clear on is that financial literacy is fine. Nothing wrong with financial literacy. Although I would also argue that people who are poor are far more financially literate than folks who have more expendable income. You got to be able to track your money.
Listen, I put a pin in that because you're absolutely right. People
Yeah,
are surprised because
yeah,
you don't have a limited fund, so you get crafty, right, and you get down to the cent in terms of budgeting
exactly.
when you are on that lower socioeconomic status.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think financial literacy will not solve the crisis because it's not what created the crisis. The crisis is created by, basically racialized capitalism. Really, if you want to get, sort of like super real about it, it was
Mm-hmm.
created by intentional structures that existed before the founding of this country and continue to this day. They were set up in ways that create, inequitable outcomes in the financial realm.
Yeah.
And so that's why we're here.
So one of the things you said before we get into the deeper
Yeah.
topic around the racial, and we'll make that transition, but I want to understand even your background a little bit more. So you mentioned that you started out as a community organizer. What is that, right? For someone
Yeah.
who's not thought about what is a community organizer, who'd you work with? How did you even hear about that, right? Because I'm pretty sure you don't see folks recruiting for community organizers at career fairs. So how did you get there?
Absolutely. Although, funnily enough, once I did become an organizer, we started doing some career, traveling. But like this, it's rare. I had never heard of community organizing when I applied for the job. A friend and I moved down after graduating together to DC. We both didn't like the cold weather in the upstate New York. And she was on housing for the first day, and I was on the job search. And the very first job, and I saw, I think, was activism, maybe. And I said, "Would you like to fight slumlords and push for a living wage and make sure that the wealthy pay their fair share?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, I'm all about that." So I called in for an interview and ended up finding out that was the DC ACORN, which is Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now, is what ACORN stood for or stands for. Organization no longer exists, and that's a whole nother podcast because it was destroyed by this right-wing attack organization with these falsified video clips that hit the media. And I'm happy to say that now that organization has just collapsed. And so I'm like, well, there is some karmic justice there. But community organizing is different. Folks might be familiar with labor organizing, especially now with the strikes going on, where you're getting folks in a workplace together to fight for their rights. But the difference is that you're organized, and this was neighborhood-based community organizing that we did. There is also faith-based and sort of other models.
Yeah.
And so we go to, a neighborhood, in a lower income neighborhood in town, and this is what community organizers around the neighborhood-based organizers do. And you knock on doors and ask people what they want to see changed in their neighborhood. I mean, it's as simple as that. And then you also have them people, I like for them to do trash pickup regularly. I like for them to clean up this house on the corner that's been vacant for years and like it's attracting rats and all kinds of problems.
Right.
They're like, but I can't do it. And folks like, I've called, I've done this. And so you just continue engagement. Folks say, well, what if there were 10 people? Well, I don't know. What about 50? What if there are 100 people? People are like, well, 100 people, that's going to get some attention. I'm like, well, let's make that happen. And that's literally what you do. It's like, who are your neighbors who feel similarly?
Yeah.
Like, do you have a house meeting? We can bring folks together and figure out what is a shared goal that you all have. Does everybody say like we want to go, after this abandoned property and get it fixed up, or whatever the issue is? So community organizers really like the staffer for low income community neighborhoods. Our goal as organizers to do the logistics, to help set up the meetings, help reserve the church is going to be the meeting space of the rec center, to run out the copies for the flyers. And again, I came up in organizing in the mid '90s, so it looks very different different now. There's digital organizing. We don't have to have our little clipboards walking down the street with our little walk blocks to check off, but it's very much a responsive model. And which isn't to say that there's not analysis. There are a couple of schools of thought that diverged in organizing, because one came from the sort of the guy considered to be the father of organizing, whose name somehow is escaping me, but he was a white guy and thought, like, just bring people together and neighbors will get what they want. And that's fine and well if you don't have an ideology, right? If you don't have an analysis that this is not a just system we're living in. So
Right.
that means that you might knock on the doors in a neighborhood and there are a lot of elderly folks saying, hey, these guys on the street, they're causing harm. They're dealing drugs. They make us worried, and I want them locked up. Now, with the initial model, is it okay? Well, then we put people together to get the guys off the corner.
Right.
An ideological based model, a social justice based organizing model says, like, okay, well, why do you think those guys are on the corner? And then you start to unpack, well, there actually aren't any job opportunities. Well, our education system
Mm-hmm.
is problematic. And then you're like, okay, well, let's look at the root cause of the problem, right? Because moving those
Right.
guys off the corner doesn't change, who's going to come on the corner next, right?
That's
We have to get to the root causes. True community organizing is about taking the lead of the community, but also helping folks shape an ideology around going to the root cause of an issue, so that we're addressing those and not putting band-aids on problems, because band-aids, only last so long.
Yes. Thank you so much for taking the time to break that down, because I feel like a lot of
Sure.
folks really don't understand or may not know.
Yeah.
And by folks, I'm talking about myself, right? May not know truly what community organizing consists of. Like, I had a general working knowledge, but I also didn't want to assume that everyone does. But certainly
Right.
what you shared expanded my existing knowledge was of community organizing. So thank you so much for that. I think to start talking a little bit about the wealth gap, you mentioned earlier that financial literacy alone can't solve the racial wealth gap. And one of the terms that you mentioned was racial capitalism. And while I am familiar with that term, because it was a big part of my dissertation research, for our listeners, what is racial capitalism and how did it come to create what we now are experiencing, or the buzz term of the racial wealth gap?
Absolutely. So I'm going to just pull a piece of paper because I want to quote Cedric Robinson, who created the term, and I want to quote him precisely because
Okay.
he came up with this concept in 1983. So the concept is that the racial capitalism, that exploitation and capital accumulation reinforce each other. So Cedric Robinson argued, and I quote here, that the development, organization, and expansion of capitalist society pursued essentially racial directions. And so what that means in the U.S., we have a country built on stolen land with stolen labor. And that stolen land and stolen labor is that's not an incidental reality, right? But by 1865, at the end of the Civil War, the U.S. became the wealthiest nation in the world, but that was a direct consequence of these 1.5 billion acres of land being stolen and using
Mm,
enslaved labor to not just improve the living conditions of the people, of the plantation owners, but really to dominate the textile industry. So by the outbreak of the Civil War, the market value, quote unquote, of enslaved people was more than that of banks, factories, and railroads combined. So I just want to let that
wow.
sink in. All the banks in the country, all the
Mhm.
factories in the country, all the railroads had less value than the market value, quote unquote, of enslaved people. So
Wow.
what that does is, from pre enslaved, you have this whole economy where you have very limited expenditures, very easy to dominate the field again when you have endless labor, and when you can use, frankly, rape as a means of expanding your labor force. So you
Yeah.
can extract race from wealth creation in this country. And
Right.
then what you have is, I'm sure many. I'm imagining many of your listeners are familiar with the 40 acres and a mule concept.
Yep.
A lot of people might not know that there were a sliver of black folks who got the 40 acres. A mule was actually not officially part. It's like, we'll give you 40 acres and maybe loan some mules, was actually part of the General Sherman's order. And in South Carolina, they actually started distributing the land to some black folks, at 40 acres each, and then. In this effort to really reunite the country and make sure everybody was happy and to be forgiving, they said, never mind folks who committed treason against the country, you can have your land back. This is how we're going to move forward by not alienating the South. So they took the land back and gave it to the previous plantation owners, which is just, a horrible thing. And again, the 40 acres even then would not have been adequate. They could not adequately distribute to the 4 million enslaved people at that time. But what that meant, so you move from that extreme free labor, and what do plantations do then? Like, right? And they haven't been investing in public schools because they didn't care about poor white people being employees. They didn't need it. They're going to pay them. They were going to hire them. So this is really just the wealthy elite here. So you have no meaningful public services in the South compared to in the North, where slavery didn't exist as long in practice, but they very much, benefited from enslaved labor. I mean, the financial industry, Wall Street, was
Right.
literally created by slave people. There's a literal wall built to keep the Lenape tribe from reclaiming their land. So, like, Wall Street was literally built with slave labor, and then the street was named that way. But so then you move from the Civil War era to, like, immediately after the Civil War. Yes, emancipation, but when you don't have that 40 acres, so folks go from to having, from having nothing to also having nothing, including a place to stay, right? So people got really clever in the South and said, well, we're just going to change some laws and create things called black codes to maintain this racial hierarchy. So it suddenly became illegal to change employers without permission. It became illegal to be unemployed. And again, only black people were being arrested for these offenses. Selling cotton after sunset was an arrestable offense, by 1890, right? So what they do then, so you'd arrest folks, and then they would lease them out to plantation owners. So again, you go from being enslaved and having no freedom to being arrested to then having to work for not necessarily the exact same plantation owner, but for plantation owners.
Right.
And again, that just shows in a system where there is no opportunity for black wealth creation, and there's extreme extraction happening. And then, although of course we still have folks in prison right now, incarcerated folks working
Yeah.
for pennies on the dollar,
Yeah.
often for corporations. So it's not as if the 14th Amendment freed us from slavery, except as punishment of a crime.
Right. That was the new Jim Crow. For those who haven't read, like, the whole prison system is yet another example, to your point, of racial capitalism in
Yeah.
sort of how they found new ways to basically enslave, right? Because they're free-ish labor
Yeah.
in terms of they come at a very low cost of overhead to what they produce.
Exactly, exactly. So you sort of couple all that and you see how race and capitalism have been intertwined. And even with the beginning of the creation of race, which is again a different, story, early on, there were like 50 different racial categories because races were even identified as nationalities and religions. So you had like Germans really good at working in here, but like Polish are much better at this. And you look at the whole list, and strangely enough, white European men were the only people who were not bad at anything. Go figure. And this racist created system. So you have all this, and you go all the way through World War I, and to the creation of the New Deal. So folks might remember that the New Deal was, FDR, need to generate income. Like people were in bad shape, right? Because we need to fund the war effort, and there was a war, and we were basically the plan to get out of the depression that again was started by the wealthy elite by over leveraging themselves. Very similar model to what we saw in 2008.
2008, yep.
And so they're okay. We've got to figure out something to sort of save the country. So you create things like the biggest thing really was the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC,
Okay.
which was created to subsidize mortgages. Before the war, before the New Deal, you had to pay about 50% down for most mortgages, and the mortgage terms, I want to say either 5 or 10 years. So very, very short terms for paying off a loan and much bigger investments.
Yeah.
So what the New Deal did was say, like, okay, we're going to have a government entity that will insure these loans, will guarantee these loans, will extend the payment period, and that essentially created the white middle class, right? So folks think about New Deal as creating the middle class, but it was really very explicitly the white middle class because less than 3% of folks who were not white were given access to these loans. And they made things even worse by creating what folks might have heard of as redlining.
Yep.
And redlining is when the Homeowners Loan Corporation literally would take maps of major metropolitan areas and draw a red line around areas that were not suitable for loans. You won't be surprised to hear those areas were predominantly black areas, right? So it could be even wealthy black areas where you have the black doctors, because we have segregation. So like we have black only communities in lots of places. So black doctors, black funeral directors, like the black elite, the wealthy elite, who had more money, say, than a neighboring poor white town. Didn't matter. They were redlined and considered to be a bigger risk than a poor white community. So what can you do with that? And then the white communities had explicit legally racist laws saying you have race covenants, saying this community doesn't allow people of color. And people of color, and also there would be Jewish people, the language changed, like blacks, Mexicans, Jews, it could be anything, any sort of configuration, but whoever was not considered white at that time, right? Because we know
And that's changed over the years too, but we won't go down that rabbit hole, right?
Exactly. The creation of whiteness with, just fascinating history. Because, yeah, just a brief whiteness side note. 99.9% there of our genes, are the same in humanity. There is
Mhm.
more racial diversity within a race than across races. So you and I, as Black people,
Mhm.
could be more distinct genetically than you and I are from Taylor Swift. Because again, I don't understand the mechanics, the science of it, but it's documented that, again, there's more genetic variety within races than across races, which just underscores how much this is a false concept. So you have all this happening. You have the creation of the white middle class, where white folks are able to suddenly build wealth and use that wealth to pass it on to their generation, to future generations, to subsidize school, education for their kids. Black folks don't have that access. Other folks of color have varying levels. Indigenous folks and Black folks have been, the worst off, but problematic all along. And then you have sort of, again, all these systems being created by the government, like Social Security. Yay, great Social Security. Well, the problem with that was that initially it excluded farm workers and domestic workers, and these are positions that were predominantly held by folks of color. So I can tell you the exact number. So by the time in 1935, 65% of all Black Americans and 70 to 80% of Black Southerners were ineligible for Social Security because of these occupation classifications.
Wow.
Um, in the meantime, they're still paying into taxes. We're still subsidizing white wealth creation. So that's,
Mhm.
I could go on and on. So that gives you a sense of how race and capitalism have always been intertwined, even from the creation of race in this country, sort of the codification of race in this country after Bacon's Rebellion, which just briefly was a time when some white landowners wanted more land and it appealed to the governor of Virginia, which is still a colony. So like, hey, we need more land. We want to attack this tribe, and the governor's like, no, we're good. That's a lot of
Mhm.
a lot of time, effort, money. We don't need it. But like, so Bacon is the guy. Bacon is the person who comes and says, okay, look, we want to push back and we want more land. So let's come together. So Bacon recruits freed Black people, enslaved Black people, indentured white people, everybody. So, some poorer land owners, like, we're going to, fight against the governor of the colony so that basically we can take more native land, essentially. So this is a massive rebellion, incredibly successful, burned down Jamestown, Virginia, and that freaked people out and said, like, oh, wait, wait a second. There is a lot of alignments of poor white folks and poor Black folks, freed or
Mhm.
indentured or not, or in similar situations in terms of having sort of access to wealth. So we can't have this. What do we do? How do we separate this? And then race became increasingly important. Like, what a distinction we have is skin color. So what we'll do is we will give white folks privileges they didn't have before. Now, these privileges aren't privileges they're going to give them wealth, to be clear, right?
Right.
You now are allowed to punish a Black person. Black folks are no longer allowed, after Bacon's Rebellion, no longer allowed in Virginia to employ white people, which shows you that Black people were employing white people. So they just sort of made these Black codes sort of spread throughout the South. And again, very intentionally weren't about giving poor white folks any real access, but it elevated them over enslaved Black people. So that's a very, brief version of how race became. It was what began this cementing race in this country to protect the wealth of the
Yeah.
elite.
Well, that's all for today, folks. Enjoyed the show? Be sure to like and rate the podcast. You can find the Race, Wealth, and Health podcast on multiple platforms, including Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss an episode. I also want to hear from you, so don't forget to connect with me on social media. You can follow the podcast on Instagram and Facebook at Race, Wealth, Health. By joining the online community, you'll stay updated on the latest episodes, behind the scenes insights, and engaging discussions. Share your thoughts, comments, and questions there. I appreciate your support in sharing the podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues who may also find value in these conversations. Thank you again for joining me on this journey. Until next time, take care, stay informed, and keep up the good fight for equality.